distinguished colleagues, friends, it's really a privilege and honor for me because I am not a professional historian, I am not even a professional social scientist. I am a mere writer or a student of cultural history or literature. So it's indeed a privilege to be here. I thought I should be sharing some reflections, some concerns about the idea of India. Historians know that this idea of India, the Nehruvian or Gandhian, or more generally speaking, the democratic idea of India, is not just only one idea of India. There has been a challenging, competitive idea of India also. In the context of looking at the freedom movement, this alternative idea of India comes out very clearly about its assumptions. And here I quote from Golwalkar, his book Bunch of Thoughts. This is 1966. And he writes, I quote, "The theories of territorial nationalism and of common danger, which formed the basis for our concept of nation, had deprived us of the positive and inspiring content of our real Hindu nationalism and made many of freedom movements virtually anti-British movements. Anti-Britishism was equated with patriotism and nationalism. This reactionary view has the disastrous effects upon the entire course of the freedom struggle, its leaders and the common people." Unquote. This is Golwalkar in 1966, his book Bunch of Thoughts. So this idea of India, this Gandhian, Nehruvian or democratic idea of India, had its critics. It was contested. It was contested both academically and politically. The point is, what is this idea of India which was so contested, so vehemently contested that Golwalkar accuses this kind of attitude of depriving the Hindu nation or Hindu nationhood of its content and of its force. First, I think we must be very clear about the thing that Nehruvian idea of India is not just a cultural concept. It's also an economic concept and it's also a structural concept. And therefore, you have this whole idea of mixed economy. You have this whole idea of tolerance inbuilt for the extreme opinions also. Tolerance inbuilt in the political system. And in this sense, contrary to what Mr. Golwalkar would like us to believe, in this sense, this idea of India was the natural evolution of the Indian tradition and Indian way of looking at things. The other point I wish to make about the idea of India is this. It is exciting and important because if you take these two or three individuals as representing or epitomizing certain approaches and certain stances, then Nehru, of course, as the understanding goes, represents the Western modernity, the rationalism, secularism and all that in its best and according to some people in its rather worrisome forms. But idea of India is not just about Western modernity, which came to us in the form of colonial modernity. It is also about our own vernacular modernity, I wish to call it vernacular modernity, which is expressed and articulated in the Bhakti tradition, in the Bhakti poetry of all Indian languages from 14th century to 17th and 18th century. Gandhi's deep involvement with, for example, Narsi Mehta or figures like Mirabai or Kabir, and in a certain way even with Tulsidas. I mean, I for one am not embarrassed at all about Gandhian idea of Ramrajya, because he was reading Ramrajya in his own way. Nehru, in fact, made it very clear in Discovery of India, in the very beginning of Discovery of India, He expresses categorically his discomfort with the organized religion. And at the same time, he recognizes that whether in organized form or in some other form, religion has the hold on human consciousness because of its capacity to take human imagination beyond empirical knowledge and science of the given time. So, this insistence or this yearning for pluralism was not just Nehru's own, which was imposed. It was actually the political articulation of inherent diversity, plurality of Indian ways of looking at things. As we know, this idea of India is slipping away like a sand from our palm. Let us face this fact clearly. And why? The answer to this question can also be very philosophical, very abstract, and even self-congratulatory. कि साहब हम तो सब कुछ कर रहे हैं फिर भी अब क्या करें, हो रहा है. Or there could be very sophist kind of answers to this question. But I think we should ask this question more critically, more self-consciously, that why this idea of India is slipping away from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Agrawal, for a wonderful talk. Thank you, Professor Prabhat Patnaik.
Both the emphasis on self-reliance and the emphasis on expanding the basic and heavy industry sector, the capital goods producing sector, were in a sense enjoined upon the Indian economy by the fact that our export prospects were limited. Now this has been the point which has been more or less accepted both by the proponents of the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy as well as its opponents. Its opponents, in particular the neoliberal economists, have actually argued that this export pessimism assumption which underlay the Nehruvian economic strategy was a false assumption. Innumerable amount of research has taken place to show that really speaking, the constraint on India's exports arose not from the world demand side, but from the domestic production side. Incidentally, I should say that our former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's PhD thesis actually argued this. It was submitted to Oxford University. This argument says that really speaking, India's export pessimism was unjustified. On the contrary, it was actually one of those self-fulfilling prophecies, because you did not believe that exports could be pushed out. You made no efforts to push out exports. Instead, you started producing a whole range of goods on your own, which you could have been better off importing from abroad. So the Nehruvian economic strategy, which now the World Bank would call the inward-looking economic strategy, because it's one that actually believes that it is better to produce things domestically than to rely upon trade. This inward-looking economic strategy has been much criticized of late, and as you know, the whole logic of economic liberalization is really to get out of both the strategy as well as the institutional structure that was built up in order to provide, in order to, as it were, bring about or, effect this strategy. The critics, there's another range of critics. Pramit Chaudhary of Sussex University is a very prominent example of this, who actually argued that while the export pessimism assumption was a justified one, so they are not neoliberal, at the same time, the constraint upon expanding domestic productive capacity was misunderstood. That the constraint was seen in terms of a shortage of capital goods, but really speaking it was a shortage of wage goods. That in effect, therefore, they would criticize the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy on the grounds not that it emphasized self-reliance, but that from its emphasis on self-reliance, it drew the conclusion that we had to expand the capital goods sector, while as a matter of fact, we had to expand the agricultural sector, the wage goods producing sector. In fact, Pramit Chaudhary argued in his book, well-known book, Indian Economy, Poverty and Development, that a major reason for the persistence of poverty was the fact that Mahalanobis strategy, or the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, really underemphasized agriculture. Now, I think it's worth going a little bit into this so-called underemphasis of agriculture, that many people who are associated with plan formulation at that time, like Dr. S.R. Sen or Professor K.N. Raj, who was my teacher, their assumption was the following. The assumption was that when it comes to expanding capital goods production, you needed to produce those capital goods in order to add to capacity. When it comes to agriculture, really speaking, agriculture was, in Dr. S.R. Sen's words, which were quoted in Professor Chakravarti's book, agriculture was a bargain sector. That really you didn't require much investment in agriculture. What you required was institutional changes, land reforms, changes in the organization of production, but not so much actually large amount of investment. Or as economists would put it, that the output capital ratio in agriculture could be greatly enhanced through institutional changes like land reforms, tenancy reform, security of tenure and so on, and land redistribution. But this is something which therefore meant that you could concentrate your investable resources for expanding capital goods production, and on the other hand do institutional changes to expand agricultural production. As a matter of fact, the latter did not happen, which has been the left criticism of the Nehruvian strategy, namely that land reforms, the changes in land reform, there was of course a certain amount of land reforms, but basic changes in the structure of land ownership is something that did not happen, and had it happened, then you would have got a major boost to agricultural production, which did not happen. But that is one range of criticism. Let me come back to the other criticism which I mentioned earlier, namely that the assumption of export pessimism was an invalid assumption. Now, this is something which, of course, was empirically argued at that time by Surendra Patel, who was a very well-known economist, in an article in the Economic Journal, where he actually showed the constraints on India's exports arose on the demand side. But as I said, subsequently, there has been a very substantial amount of literature, including Dr. Manmohan Singh's PhD thesis, and subsequently my own JNU colleague, Professor Deepak Nayyar's PhD thesis, all of which argued that, really speaking, India's exports were constrained not on the demand side, but on the supply side. Now, one can actually go into this whole question. Jagdish Bhagwati and Padma Desai, in their book on Indian industrialization, have argued that Professor Mahalanobis, being a physicist, was unaware of the trade possibilities, or tend to kind of, not take the trade possibilities seriously. I mean, poo-poo the trade possibilities and so on. But I don't think that's right. Mahalanobis had a more sophisticated understanding of the whole question of trade. But let's not go into that. The question which arises is that, was this in fact, let us even assume that export pessimism prevailed, but was that the rationale of the Nehruvian strategy? And I would submit not. I would submit that an alternative reading of the Nehru-Mahalanobis development strategy. Now, for this alternative reading, I would like to rely on a certain categorization of the economy which had been done by a very well-known statistician economist, Ashok Rudra. He wrote a book called Relative Rates of Growth, Agriculture and Industry, and he divided the Indian economy into three sectors. One is what he called agriculture and agro-based industries, all kind of one. The other is what he called mining and mineral-based industries. And the third is what he called universal intermediaries like coal, petroleum, electricity, and so on. And he found an extremely interesting pattern, namely that while of course universal intermediaries enter into all kinds of sectors, that's why they are universal intermediaries, or called so, agriculture and agro-based industries provided, or the mining and mineral-based industries required zero inputs, or almost zero inputs, statistically insignificant amount of inputs from agriculture and agro-based industries. Of course, they require food. The workers employed in those sectors would require food. But then, leaving that aside, when it comes to current inputs, what economists call the input-output table, when it comes to current inputs, mining and mineral-based industries required virtually zero inputs from agriculture and agro-based industries. At that time in the 1950s, the reverse was also true, namely agriculture and agro-based industries didn't require much inputs from mines and mineral-based industries. But that probably would not be true now, given the changes which have taken place in the agrarian technology in the more recent period. But be that as it may, the fact is that therefore you could have a substantial increase when it comes to the output of mining and mineral-based industries that actually does not require, or that does not impinge on the agricultural sector in the form of demanding larger agricultural inputs. Now, in most countries with a tropical land mass which is limited in size, let us assume for a moment that productivity per acre is given, in which case what this land mass produces in the aggregate is given. If that is given, then any unit expansion in agriculture and agro-based industries would require a substantial increase, or would require a certain positive increase in agricultural raw materials. If the output of the land mass is given, then that would give rise to a reduction in food grain output. And if it gives rise to a reduction in food grain output, it will give rise to a reduction in food grain availability. This, incidentally, was exactly what was happening in the last 50 years of colonial rule. Blin's figures show that in the last 50 years of colonial rule, starting from roughly about 200 kilograms per person per year as the per capita food grain availability in what is called British India at the beginning of the 20th century, per capita food grain availability had declined to about 136 kilograms at the time of independence, and even if you take a kind of average, it was certainly below 150 kilograms. You have had, therefore, a very substantial 25% drop in the per capita food grain availability, and in a sense you can understand things like the Bengal famine against the background of that particular drop which had taken place. Therefore, hunger, malnutrition, poverty were on the increase, precisely because on the one hand the output per acre on the limited tropical land mass was not increasing, because we know that land augmenting investment, what economists would call land augmenting investment, that kind of investment like in irrigation, which gives rise to multiple cropping, which raises yields and so on per acre, had not taken place throughout these last 50 years. On the other hand, you had more and more land being devoted to the production of agricultural raw materials, because of which per capita food grain availability was declining. Now, of course, with post-independence having a government of our own in free India, you would find that land augmenting investment would be increasing, as indeed it did increase. You had substantial investment in multipurpose projects, in irrigation and so on, and you also had a substantial increase in net sown area in the first 5-year plan period, subsequently in gross sown area, and at a later date when the Green Revolution occurred through high yielding varieties of seeds in land productivity. But while land augmentation did occur, at the same time, the fact remains that for any particular level of land augmentation, an emphasis on agriculture and agro-based industries jeopardizes your food security to a much greater extent than an emphasis on mines and mineral-based industries that makes zero demand as far as the agricultural sector is concerned in terms of its inputs. It followed, therefore, that one has to think in terms of the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, not just because of the world demand for Indian exports being limited, but rather it is a desirable strategy per se. Even if the world demand for India's exports had been infinitely elastic, that you could sell any amount of agriculture, agro-based exports in the world market, nonetheless it would make sense from the point of view of food security in the country, which had been progressively getting undermined in the last 50 years of colonial rule, to make sure that you did two things. One, that you actually increased land augmenting investment, and secondly, that you actually shifted the structure of production from in industry from agriculture and agro-based industries to mining and mineral-based industries. This is precisely what the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy tried to do. There was, let us not forget to start with, the Grow More Food campaign, which began immediately after independence, and subsequently, as I mentioned, there was an increase in net sown area, there was an increase in irrigation, and as a matter of fact, roughly by 1964-65, India's per capita food grain availability, which had fallen to below 150 kilograms per person per year, at the time of independence, about 148 kilograms if you take quinquennial averages, actually increased to 168 kilograms around the time of Nehru's death. Now, subsequently, we know that with economic liberalization, there has been a change which has taken place. As a matter of fact, in the post-Nehruvian period, apart from 2 years in the mid-60s, which were characterized by Bihar famine and so on, then the Green Revolution occurred, and after the Green Revolution, per capita food grain availability continued to increase, and of course it reached about 180 kilograms at the end of the 1980s, after which there has been a decline, where today the per capita food grain availability is lower than at the time of Nehru's death, about 161 kilograms per person per year. So the point is that when we are talking in terms of the Nehruvian economic strategy, and let's be very clear, Nehruvian economic strategy does not just refer to the period of Nehru's lifetime, but it is roughly the economic strategy followed prior to the introduction of liberalization. You find two things, and both of which have to be seen as part of this strategy. One is an increase in land augmenting investment and technological progress, through which, notwithstanding the fact of limited tropical landmass, food security is improved, per capita food grain availability is improved. And the second is shifting your industrial structure away from agriculture and agro-based industries towards mining and mineral-based industries, which of course do not again, which again are conducive to the improvement in your food security. Now, to my mind, these were the two main characteristics of the Nehruvian economic strategy, and in a certain sense, the post-liberalization period has actually seen an undermining of food security as well as a stagnation in industry. So you actually find that at the moment, not only do we have a virtual stagnation in manufacturing sector, but what is more, you also have a significant undermining of food security, and consequently those who argue in terms of the benefits of trade and that the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy underestimated the potential benefits of trade because of a false assumption of export pessimism are, to my mind, barking up the wrong tree. The last point I want to make is the following: that this is not just referring to India. This is not just referring to a particular period in India's economic history, but I believe this has a deeper relevance, and that arises from the fact that, as a matter of fact, metropolitan capitalism cannot do without a whole range of products which are produced in the tropical landmass. Increase in the output of the tropical landmass, as I said, depends upon land augmenting investment and technological progress which can be introduced on this landmass. Typically, such investment and technological progress is introduced by the state. This is something which, for instance, Marx, you remember, had said that, that the Eastern empires had actually three main departments. One was the Department of Revenue, which is plundering your own people. The other was the Department of War, which is plundering other people. And the third was the Department of Irrigation. That fundamentally, and Karl Wittfogel went on to develop a whole theory of Oriental despotism based precisely on the assumption that irrigation projects essential for land augmentation in tropical areas can basically be sustained by the state. Now, in a situation where, as under the gold standard earlier, or as is the case now, where you have fiscal responsibility legislation, where the state is hamstrung in terms of enlarging its expenditure, you have, as it were, a slackening in the state's effort at land augmenting investment, because of which, as I mentioned, there is a fall which has taken place in per capita food grain output and per capita food grain availability as well. It follows, therefore, that if we are talking in terms of an appropriate economic strategy for any country, then it is essential, first, that an improvement, I mean, any third world country of India's size with substantial hunger and malnourishment and so on, it's very important, therefore, that we have to, number one, undertake substantial land augmenting investment in the form of irrigation and other such things, which means activation of the state as a spender, as an investor. And secondly, we have to make sure that there is no drain on this limited land availability in terms of metropolitan demand for goods, and that in turn requires restrictions on exports so as to ensure that food security is met domestically. Both these require a degree of withdrawal, delinking from the pattern of economic liberalization, and I would credit the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy with having therefore not only foreseen this fundamental requirement in a country like India, but actually having implemented it in the strategy they pursued. Thank you very much.